I mean, I don't know how many times I've debated gun control proponents from the Brady campaign and other groups over the decade or so. But one question that I've often asked is, would they put up a sign in front of their home that said their home is a gun-free zone? And I've never run into anybody who's been willing to go and do that. And I think that that says a lot. So anyway, I've been asked to talk about the general issue of guns and crime today. And I suppose one thing just to think about a little bit, kind of, my talk's been a little bit out of order already, but can you name me one place in the world, doesn't have to be in the United States, one place in the world where we banned guns and seen murder rates fall? Because I can't find it. Every place that we have crime data, both before and after a ban, you're going to see some increase in murder rates and violent crime, and often very large increases in murder rates and violent crime. You know, Americans have had a fair amount of experience with gun-free zones. I suppose the most prominent cases, if people were to think about it, are places like DC and Chicago. People, I think, have some general idea that when guns were banned there, we saw increases in murders and violent crime. They may not know how big of an increase that we saw. But usually the response that you get is, well, it wasn't really a fair test, because unless you were to ban guns every place in the country, you can't expect it to work. And I suppose there's a few responses to that. One is, I'm not really sure how that explains why you see a big increase in murder. I can understand why they could say, well, that explains why you didn't see as big of a drop as we were promising people to have, but I don't think it explains the increase. And beyond that, you can look at various countries in the world which have had gun bans, and I can't, as I say, even when whole countries have banned guns, you still see increases in murder rates and violent crime. Even island nations that have banned guns, presumably the most perfect experiment, well-defined, easily defendable borders. They don't have to worry about some neighbor supplying the guns. And yet, in those cases, you still see increases in murder rates and violent crimes. And I suppose the third point is, if it was such an unfair test, it would have been nice if they'd kind of let us in on that before they passed the laws to begin with. Now, we see gun-free zones many places in the United States. Paul, earlier in his introductory remarks, was talking about legislation here in North Carolina to try to end a few of the gun-free zones. And I've been involved in these types of debates for a while. And one of the things that you often see in these discussions is some hypothetical thing about something that might possibly go wrong. And what I've kind of learned over time is just that people think that whatever the laws are right now, they think that that's the way they've always been. And that's usually not the case. And usually, rather than just guessing about some hypothetical, there's usually data that you can go and look at to see how people actually behave when you allow individuals to go and have guns. And so I'll just give you a couple examples. After 9/11, several of the airline pilots unions approached me and asked me if I'd help them to be able to let pilots carry guns on planes. I remember talking to one U.S. senator who basically said, well, look, what happens if you have two pilots on a plane, get into an argument, both pull out their guns, and they fire, and then you have two dead pilots, then what are you going to do? And, or people have watched too many James Bond movies, I think, and they see, you know, if there's an accidental discharge and there's a hole in the fuselage, they think everybody's going to be sucked out of the plane. How many pilots are there in the room? There's usually some pilots. I don't know if you realize this, but there are lots of holes already in the fuselages of planes. One more hole isn't really going to make a big difference. And in fact, in the commercial planes that you're in, there's a hole at the back of the fuselage that helps pull air through the cabin for you. So, you know, there's a reason why the Air Force isn't afraid that one bullet's going to knock airplanes out of the sky by putting a hole in some fuselage someplace. And, but, you know, with the pilots, though, you don't really need to guess about this type of thing because you may not realize this, but from 1923 until 1963, every commercial airline pilot in the United States, when they flew, was mandated to carry a loaded handgun with them whenever they flew. And the reason why that got started was when the post office started flying mail. They were worried that some biplane carrying mail would crash in a cornfield someplace, and they wanted to make sure that the pilot was going to be able to go and defend that mail. And since you wouldn't know what the cargo might be on the plane until the last moment, they just said, look, it's better that all pilots are always ready to be able to go and protect mail if they just happen to have it on their plane. And of course, the rules got started in the 1920s, and they basically stayed in place then for decades. And even up until 1979, all commercial airline pilots were still allowed to be able to carry guns with them when they flew. None of this psychological screening or other types of tests. If you're a commercial airline pilot, you're automatically mandated to go and carry a loaded handgun up until 1963. Jimmy Carter ended the practice in 1979. But, you can go and look at the records, though. We don't need to guess. The original Civil Aeronautics Board, the FAA keeps detailed records. There's not one single example with all these tens of millions of flights, literally, of a problem occurring. And yet there are several dozen cases where pilots use guns to actually have kind of like citizens arrest for people that were criminals and others that they had caught on their planes. And you see that in other areas, too. I'll just give you one other example. I don't know if anybody's read Antonin Scalia's autobiography or Colin Powell's autobiographies. These are two men who grew up in New York City. They were on the riflery teams for their public high schools. And one of the things that's interesting is that up until 1969, all but one of the public high schools in New York City had riflery teams. Apparently, on any given school day, you would have something between about 6,000 and 8,000 students that would be on the teams. They wouldn't go and keep the guns at school. They'd have to bring them with them in the morning on city streets, on buses, on subways, in taxis to get to school. They'd leave them unlocked in the back of classrooms. They would pick them up and walk them over to the riflery range in the after school and then take them home on the same subways and buses and public transportation. And yet, again, you can't find a single example of a problem occurring over what was almost 100 years that they had those types of programs for New York City schools. You go and you tell people today about that type of thing, they're going to think you're just from Mars or you're making up those types of facts. Now, I think this is asleep. Okay. Now, whoops. I want to talk to you a little bit about types of data before we get into this a little bit more, because it's something that I'm sure you hear all the time. Probably the most common type of data that's used in discussions about gun control are what academics refer to as cross-sectional data, which means you look across different places at one point in time. So I'm sure you've heard the argument about, well, the United Kingdom has relatively few guns, have relatively few murders. The United States has a lot of guns, a lot of murders, and so therefore it's the fact that we own a lot of guns causes so many murders. As I've tried to explain to Piers Morgan a few times, that you end up, the thing is, if you look before they even had the gun control laws in the UK, they had even lower murder rates than they have now. That they've gone up after they've had these types of bans. But the problem is there are very few academics that go and actually use what we call purely cross-sectional data anymore because it's just impossible to really adequately control for the differences across places. There's lots of reasons why the UK had even lower murder rates than the United States before they had any gun control there, or before they banned handguns, for example. And I'll just give you one example. I'll give you many of these. A few years ago, the New York Times had a large series on the death penalty. And they looked across states and they said, look, the murder rate is actually higher in the states that have the death penalty than the states that don't have it. Of course, the New York Times concluded that this at least shows that the death penalty doesn't deter crime, and they said possibly even makes things worse. And there's a simple problem with this, and that is the states that didn't have the death penalty were states like Alaska, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Vermont, places like that. Most of them were small, rural states that had always had low murder rates. And so here's the problem that you face, and that is, let's say you have states with relatively high murder rates that are the ones that adopt the death penalty. The death penalty could cause the murder rate to fall, but by still be higher than the low murder rate places that never felt the need to go and adopt it. If I'm only looking across places, it's going to make it look like death penalties associated with more murders, even though it actually caused it to fall from what it was before. The only way you can really get at the problem is to go and follow these jurisdictions over time to see what happened to murder rates before and after they changed their death penalty, maybe take into account how frequent the executions are, and try to see how the places that change their rules, how their murder rates are changing relative to the jurisdictions that didn't change their rules over time. And I think when you try to look at that way, what we'd call panel data, following lots of jurisdictions over time, you in fact see that the death penalty does reduce murder rates. But it's kind of hard to get away from this discussion. If you read the New York Times since Newtown, there's probably about 20 times that you can go and see where they have mentioned something called the Small Arms Survey, which is a study done by a relatively liberal group that claims that the level of gun ownership in different countries. And they'll say the United States has the most, about 88 guns per 100 people. Switzerland, they'll say, is about 47 per 100 people. A country like Israel is way down over here, supposedly of about 7 per 100 people. There are real problems with this, even though everybody uses this data. And that is, I just mentioned something with the countries that we just looked at, and that is, for Switzerland, in 2007, which is when they had the data, you have a situation where all able-bodied males between the ages of 18 and 42 were mandated to have a machine gun in their home. After age 42, you can go and apply for an exemption to go and keep it longer than that, and almost everybody does. So virtually all the households have a machine gun in their home, or they did. But the problem is, the Small Arms Survey didn't count those as guns owned by Swiss, because they were technically owned by the government. If the question is, what is it like having people have guns in their homes, then you're going to care whether it's owned by the government or it's owned by the individuals. Is it a gun that's in people's home or not? And so it seems like you'd want to count that. And if you do, the gun ownership rate in Switzerland is about 20 percentage points higher than it is in the United States. In Israel, also, almost all the guns are technically owned by the government there. But if you've been to Israel or studied it, the percentage of the population that's legally able to carry concealed handguns is about 15% of the adult Jewish population. But the reason why they want to reduce the claimed gun ownership rate for Switzerland or Israel is because they have very low murder rates, among the lowest in the world. And you go and have countries out there, I'll show you in a minute when you just look at developed countries, and it affects the results a lot. But you can see if you look at all the countries that they looked at, and they didn't look at an unbiased sample, if you look at all the countries, there's still a negative relationship, this regression line here, between even this kind of wacky measure of gun ownership and homicide rates. If you just take the countries that the Small Arms Surveys looked like, you can see this here. This is the United States in terms of homicide rates. Here it is for all countries. So this is from the World Health Organization, UN basically. You can see the United States is this red line right here, and this is homicide rates for around the world. Now, if you just look at developed countries, you can see, excluding the United States, so essentially just ask, what can the United States learn from looking at other developed countries? You, in fact, see that countries that are claimed to have higher gun ownership rates have lower homicide rates. It's essentially this line right here. Now, if you were to get Switzerland and Israel, have them way out over here with their low murder rates, would actually cause this line to be a little bit more negative. The reason why I'm excluding the United States, first of all, is just one, if we look at other countries, what do we learn? But secondly, what they've done is usually they have the United States way out by itself. It has a murder rate that's up here. And just that one data point, because it's so far out in the sample, it actually kind of pulls the line up here, so it's a little bit positive. If you fix Switzerland and Israel, and I could fix other countries' data too, that by itself would more than offset the higher rate from the United States, so you still would get a negative rate there. Again, I don't find cross-sectional data particularly useful. In fact, I find it completely unuseful. But I just want to show, even if you use the type of data that's used in the general discussions there, you still get this relationship of higher gun ownership rates associated with lower homicide rates. Now I want to kind of talk a little bit about how things look over time. Again, these are generally the discussions I've had in my books, More Guns, Less Crime, for example. I could give you 30 pages of quotes about people, what predictions were being made by politicians and by others when Heller decision came down from the Supreme Court in June 2008, striking down D.C.'s gun laws. Then Mayor Adrian Fenty for Washington, D.C. said more handguns in the District of Columbia will lead to more violence. Again, I could give you 30 pages of quotes. I'm not going to bore you with that. There's a difference between what happened in D.C. and what happened in Chicago that's kind of important to go through for a second. And that is, everybody knows how the Supreme Court struck down the handgun bans. But practically, there was something much more important. And the reason why I say practically is because very few people have been able to go and get handgun permits in either of those two cities. And according to the Washington Post, it costs like $534 to go through the licensing and registration process to get a handgun in D.C. Probably costs nearly $400 to go through the process in Chicago. Few people get it, a couple thousand, few thousand people, and they basically tend to be wealthy whites. My research convinced me anything, it's basically people most likely to be victims of violent crime, poor blacks, who live in these high crime urban areas, who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. They're the ones that you'd see the biggest benefit if you allowed them to go and own these guns. But they're the ones who are priced out. So you have two effects. One, few people get the licenses and registration. And those who do aren't the ones who benefit the most, aren't the ones you're going to see the biggest reductions in crime for. D.C., though, also had one thing that wasn't in the Chicago case, and that was it had been a felony for you to actually load a long gun in D.C. You could legally register and license a long gun, but if you actually put a bullet in the chamber or a shotgun shell in the chamber, it was a 5-year felony that you would face there. And so the Supreme Court basically said, look, we can say you have a right to self-defense, but if it's a felony to actually load the gun, it kind of eviscerates the whole benefit that we get from saying that you have that benefit. So they struck down the gun lock provisions. Now the reason why that's important is that at the time there were about 72,000 adults in Washington, D.C. who had legally licensed and registered long guns. And they were now able overnight to be able to go and use those guns for self-defense. That's about a quarter of the adult population in D.C. who now could use their guns for self-defense that couldn't do so previously. Now, well, let me just back up a second. There's different ways I could show you this data. I'm just going to show you data on how crime rates change over time in D.C. and Chicago. The simplest way is just to say, how did crimes change? In Washington, D.C., after the ban went into place, there's only 1 year where the murder rate in D.C. was as low as it was prior to the ban going into effect. In Chicago, there's no year. Now, obviously, that's a little bit too simple of a way of looking at the data. Another way you can do it is compare it to other cities. If you look at DC's rank in terms of murder rates among the top 50 cities, immediately prior to the ban, it ranked about 20. In the years that the ban was in effect, the 30 years, half the time it was either number 1 or number 2 in the country in terms of murder rates, and 2/3 of the time it was in the top 4. There's no period prior to the ban where DC was even remotely close to being even in the top 15, let alone being in the top 4 consistently like that. Now, there's a third way we could look at this. It's a little bit less dramatic, but essentially it's just saying DC's murder rate as a ratio relative to the average murder rate in the other 50 largest cities. And DC's murder rate was falling prior to the ban. After the ban, it went up. The ban went into effect in February 77. And it bounced around about 40, 60. You go about 13 years out, DC's murder rate was about 80% higher than the murder rate in the other cities. Now, there's a reason why I just show you the first 13 years to begin with, because after that, it shoots up. There's a 4-year period of time here when you have a crack cocaine epidemic. It's national, but yet it seemed to have a much bigger effect in DC, I would argue in part because people were less able to go and defend themselves. But even after the crack cocaine epidemic ended, it stayed much higher than it was at that time. And now there's something else I can show you here, and that is, well, what's happened after the Heller decision? I showed you before the quotes, the predictions about disaster that was going to befall DC. Now, there's a couple different ways I could do this. One way is just to show you the whole year data. I'm not going to do that, though the results are very similar. And the reason why I'm not going to show you that is because the law changed in the middle of the year. And so what I want to try to do is, if the Supreme Court decision came down June 2008, end of June, by the end of July, DC had changed its laws. So if you take those 7 months from January to the end of July, that's the last 7 months that the rules would be in effect. And just compare the same time period over each year, because murders and violent crime rates change a lot over the course of the year. You have a lot more murders and violent crime over the summer than you do during the winter. So just the same period of time each year. And what you see, I have data for 07, 08, 09, 2010, 2011, 2012. So if you just look at homicide for the same first 7 months of each year, it was 104 in 07, 107 in 08, 82 in 09. So this is the last 7 months, and this is the comparable time of the year where the rules weren't in effect. In 2010, it was down to 70. In 2011, it was 62. In 2012, it was 51. That's a 52% drop in murder rates in 4 years. You see a drop in violent crime rates across the board. There's lots of things I could point to here. I'm just going to point to one thing given time, and that is, and this is something we've seen in other areas. If you look at crimes with guns and without guns, so these are robberies, excluding guns, robberies with guns. Robberies, what you see is bigger drops in crimes with guns than crimes without guns. So crimes without guns was essentially no change. Robberies with guns fell by 11%. You see aggravated assaults without guns fell by 4%. Aggravated assaults with guns fell by 31% over that period of time. This is something, as I say, we observe in other areas as well. You can look, I could go and show you data running regressions and stuff like that. That's what I do in More Guns, Less Crime. If you want to look at it, you can look at more detail. You find even larger effects when you try to systematically account for other things like police, arrest rates, conviction rates, lots of other effects. Now you can look at Chicago. Chicago's murder rate relative to the other 10 largest cities, I can show it to you in different ways, was falling in the years prior to the ban. Ban went into effect in November 1982. After the ban went into effect, Chicago's murder rate stopped falling and started to rise. And you can see that. I can show you for relative to the 6 counties that are next to Chicago. Chicago has a higher murder rate. It's urban area relative to the counties. But prior to the ban, Chicago's murder rate was falling. After the ban, it soared fairly dramatically relative to the adjacent counties that are there. all the counties in Illinois reported data for 1984. Now, as I say, we can look around the world. I'm not going to show you data for all countries. I'm just going to show you for some island nations that we have data for. And you see a similar pattern. Here's Ireland. This is the Republic of Ireland. Its gun ban went into effect in January 1972. You can see prior to the ban going into effect, the murder rate was kind of bouncing around there. As soon as the ban went into effect, murder rates went up. When you look at the end period there, people will point out you had a lot of drug gang violence, and that's exactly right. I guess what I would point out is that the gun ban didn't stop the drug gangs from being able to go and get guns. Here's data for Jamaica. Jamaica's ban went into effect in January 1975. Again, if you look prior to that, Jamaica's murder rate was very similar to the United States murder rate. After the ban went into effect, large increases. There was some political violence in that one spike that was there. There's political violence and drug gang violence at the end of the period there. But again, even if you remove those, it's still much higher. And again, I just point out that gun bans didn't stop the drug gangs from getting a hold of guns. You know, most people don't realize how much violence in the United States is related directly or indirectly to drug gangs. The Obama administration came out with a study in 2009 claiming that 80% of violent crime was gang-related, and the vast majority of that was drug gang-related. I mean, I agree with them exactly on the numbers, but they're roughly right. You know, one way you can think about that, just get an idea, about 75% of the counties in the United States have 0 murders in any given year. You have 3% of the counties account for almost 75% of the murders. They have 23% of the population and about 75% of the murders. And if you've ever lived in one of these major cities, and the newspapers once a year will go and show a map kind of how murders are distributed there, they're not spread out equally in those counties. They're very heavily concentrated in a few areas usually, you know, 2 or 3 areas. And it's very primarily drug gang related type crimes that are occurring. Does anybody know what year we had the highest murder rate in the United States?
93?
No. 1932. 1932 was last year Prohibition. Within about 2 years after Prohibition had ended in the United States, murder rates had fallen by about 60%. And, you know, here it is think of with drug gangs. If one gang goes and steals another gang's drugs, it's not like they can go up to call up the police and say, look, could you help us get our drugs back? You know, we really want to have them. The drug gangs essentially have to set up their own militaries in order to try to go and protect their valuable property that's there. If tomorrow you could click your fingers and have all illegal drugs disappear in the United States and the weapons that they use to protect those drugs disappear, how long do you think it would take before illegal drugs started coming back into the country? A day, an hour, a week? Whatever it is, it would be pretty fast. How fast do you think it would be before they started bringing in the guns that they use to protect those illegal drugs? Even if you could instantly have caused them all to disappear right away. It'd be just as fast. They're not going to bring in that very valuable property if they didn't have some way to go and protect it from being stolen by others. Here's a diagram for the UK, and this is before and after the handgun ban that they put into place in January 1997. There's about a 50% increase in murder rates in the UK in the 8 years after the ban went into effect. And then it starts to fall. It's still a slightly higher rate than it was before the ban went into effect. But is it like a 9-year lag in Britain? You ban guns and then it goes up, and then 9 years it starts to go back down to where it was when the ban went into effect? No, I think there's a much simpler explanation for it. And that is the change in the number of police officers in the UK. I don't know if you can see it, but 2003, 2004, 2005 are the big years for the increase. You basically have an 18% increase in the number of police officers in literally just a few year period of time. Now, my research indicates to me that police are probably the single most important factor for reducing crime, even though the police understand themselves they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. They still deter criminals, and they're still extremely important. But an 18% increase in the number of police officers is a pretty dramatic increase in a short period of time. And it's not too surprising to me that right when that occurred is when you begin to see this drop in murder rates. The interesting thing is that despite having this huge increase in the number of police officers, the murder rate is still higher at the end of this period than it was prior to the ban going into effect. Now, one thing that's gotten a lot of attention, and I'll just spend a couple minutes on it, is Australia. And the New York Times, other places have claimed that the big gun buyback that they had in 96 and 97 was responsible for reduced crime and reduced gun suicides in Australia. Well, here's one fact you need to know. It's true they had a gun buyback, and it was big. It basically reduced the number of legal guns in the country from about 3.2 million to about 2.2 million. That's a large change that occurs there, about a third. But the thing that they don't mention is that as soon as the buyback was done, basically people went back and started buying guns again. And they started buying guns at a really high rate. In fact, by last year, the gun ownership rate in Australia was virtually the same as it was prior to the gun buyback. And so if this is right, if this really has the relationship that people would claim that it does, what should you see? You should see an immediate drop followed by an increase in these bad things happening, right? Because the growth rate in gun ownership is greatly exceeding the growth in population. The rate of ownership is increasing and getting back to where it was before they had the buyback. Well, here's homicides. Basically, for about 8 years after the buyback, the homicide rate's fairly constant, then begins to fall. So it's not this sudden drop and then increase. You can see for armed robberies actually soared after the gun buyback. Basically, go out about 8 or 9 years, it comes down, but it's still higher, a little higher than it was before the buyback occurred. Now you can look at suicides. It's true that suicides with guns fell after the buyback. So here's the buyback right here, and it fell. This is the dotted line, but it was falling for a decade beforehand. And there's really no change in the rate it was falling. So whatever was causing it to fall before seems to have been there too. It doesn't cause it to fall at a faster rate. The drop in suicides not involving firearms was actually about as large as the drop in firearm suicides, so it's not really clear why non-firearm suicide should fall. And the third thing is, if this is right about the pattern, we should have seen an immediate large drop in firearm suicides, and then it should have gone up, rather than this continual drop that we had begun to see beforehand. So it just kind of shows people aren't very careful with using the data. I just mentioned one other thing really fast, and that is one place in the United States that hasn't gotten much attention that's seen a big drop in gun ownership, legal gun ownership, has been Massachusetts. They had very strict licensing and registration laws that went into effect in 1998. Originally, there were about 1.54 million Massachusetts residents that legally owned guns in 1998. By the end of last year, it was down to about 200,000. They had an 86% drop in percentage of people, or number of people legally owning guns in Massachusetts over that period of time, a huge drop. So there are a couple things we can look at. This graph shows you the murder rate in Massachusetts relative to the murder rate in the United States before and after the registration rules. And you can see, it was bouncing around, but after this licensing and registration, when we've had this huge drop in gun ownership, we've seen this big increase in murder rates in Massachusetts relative to the rest of the United States. This is looking at just Massachusetts neighbors, and you can see the huge increase in Massachusetts murder rate relative to its neighbors when you had this drop. And then this is for robberies. The Massachusetts robbery rate was falling relative to its neighbors fairly dramatically prior to the licensing rules going into effect. As soon as they went into effect and gun ownership plummeted in Massachusetts, you saw this big increase in Massachusetts' robbery rate relative to its neighbors. We see a phenomenon here. You ban guns, or you reduce gun ownership dramatically, and murder and violent crime goes up. What's happened? Well, there's a very simple explanation. And that is, when you ban guns, in fact, when you pass any type of gun control law, the question you have to ask yourself is who's most likely to obey the rule? And what you find time after time is that it's basically the most law-abiding, good citizens who primarily obey the rule. I'm not saying it doesn't have any impact on the criminals. I'm sure it does. But the point is, if you pass a law that's primarily obeyed by law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, you can get these types of perverse outcomes where the exact opposite of what you'd like to have happen occurs. Let me give you an example just to think about, and that is, Virginia Tech. If you're a professor and you have a concealed handgun permit, you can carry your gun virtually any place in the state. There's only literally a few types of places in Virginia where you're not allowed to carry your permit concealed handgun. Schools, airports, courts. But if you accidentally carry your permit concealed handgun onto school property, what's going to happen? If you get caught, you're going to get fired. If you're a professor and you get fired for a firearms-related violation, 2 minutes. What's going to happen? You're going to end up, you're not getting a job anyplace else. Your academic career is over. If you're a student who carries a gun any place but accidentally carries it on school property and you get caught, you're going to get expelled. How about the person who's committed the crime and killed 32 people? The notion, he's already going to, assuming he lived, and he didn't, he died. 75% of the time people commit these crimes, they die at the scene. Even if he had lived, though, he's already going to be facing 32 life sentences or 32 death penalties. The thought that the threat of expulsion is going to be the key penalty that's going to keep him from committing this crime is just absurd. It's the law-abiding good citizens who probably would have obeyed the law anyway. They're the ones who face the real penalty. They're the ones who face the life-altering penalty from breaking that particular rule, because they're going to find that they can't go on to college anymore, or they can't teach anymore. Not the person who's killed these people. And that's this basic thing that James brought up with his first video, or what I talk about all the time, and that is, when you put up a sign like this, who's going to obey it? So nobody would put up a sign like this in front of their own home, but yet we put these types of signs in front of places that we want to protect. Why would we do something like that? If we believe that it's primarily going to be the law-abiding citizens and not the criminals who do it, then we're making it easier for criminals to go and commit these crimes rather than making it more difficult for them to go and commit them. Bill Landis and I, when we were both at the University of Chicago, looked at all the multiple victim public shootings in the United States from 1977 through 1999. I talk about this in my books. And we looked at 13 different types of gun control laws. We looked at the police activity. We looked at other types of things. The only law that we found that reduced these multiple victim public shootings was the passage of right to carry laws. When states passed these laws, there was about a 60% drop in the rate at which these types of crimes occurred, and about 78% drop in the rate at which people were killed or injured from these attacks. Now, why do you see so much bigger impact on crimes, multiple victim public shootings, than you see in murder generally? Because when states pass these laws, you'll see about a 1.5% drop in murder for each additional year that the law is in effect. Well, again, there's a simple explanation for it. We have, 120 people or 130 people here. What's the probability, any individual in North Carolina may be a 5% chance that they have a concealed handgun permit. What's the probability that at least someone, even if the probabilities for each person having a permit were independent, which is obviously not true here, what's the probability that at least someone would have a concealed handgun permit? It'd be 100%. If somebody broke in, there would at least be someone, in this case many people, who would be able to go and defend themselves. But if you go and attack somebody late at night in a dark alley or a parking lot, there's a 5% chance that an individual might be able to defend themselves, some risk to the attacker, some deterrent. But what you find consistently across these results is that as the probability that people are able to go and defend themselves increases, you see greater deterrence that's there. Now, I want to do one last issue. I know I'm breaking the time rules here, but and that is just talk about Israel's experience a little bit. And that is Israel had terrorist experiences in the 40s and on, even before it became a country. And the thing is, there are a couple of things you can learn about their attacks. When they had terrorist attacks, Israel's response was usually to hire more police or more military and put them on the street. The problem is they learned the hard ways that terrorists have huge strategic advantages. Imagine there's a terrorist on a bus, and you have 2 police officers that are there, or 2 soldiers. What can the terrorists do? One option they have is simply to be patient, to wait until the police officers leave and then engage in their attack. The second option that they have is to go and kill the police officers first and then go and kill the other people. At some point, Israel realized that no matter how much money they spent, they simply couldn't cover all the targets if the terrorists were willing to be patient long enough. And so in '72, they started allowing citizens to carry concealed handguns. How did that change the situation for the terrorists? Even if the police officers left the bus, the terrorists didn't know whether somebody behind them or to the left or the right or in front of them might also have a gun that might be able to stop them at some point. One of the interesting things you see that changed in terrorists, if you look at terrorist attacks from the 40s to the early 70s, almost all the terrorist attacks involved machine guns. After that point in time, almost all of them involved bombs. Why the change? Well, if a terrorist pulls out a machine gun, that gives people a chance to pull out their handguns and respond. If you blow yourself up with a vest, there's not much to respond to at that point. The point is that the terrorists had a choice beforehand. They could have picked machine guns, they could have picked bombs. They tend to overwhelmingly pick machine guns when they had a choice. When the rules changed, they pretty much were forced to go to their second best option. In fact, you see the lethality of each attack declined when they were forced to switch to bombs as compared to what they had previously. Now, I could go through other things, but here's the bottom line. I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But the thing is, the police understand themselves that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after crimes occurred. Police are extremely supportive of people owning guns. There was a survey done by Police One that I could show you the results for in March. They have like 400,000 police officers belong to this organization. There's like 700,000 police nationwide. What they found is that about 77% of police believed that law-abiding citizens owning guns were important for reducing crime, either extremely important or very important. That's a huge percentage of police. Police know the benefits to themselves from owning guns, and they realize they can't be there to protect you, and so they understand the benefits of civilians owning guns. There's 2 groups of people that my research shows benefit the most from having guns for protection. Basically, people who are weak physically, women and the elderly, and people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime. That's poor, overwhelmingly tends to be one group. Poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. It'd be great if the police were able to protect them, but they can't. So what I would argue is basically the most vulnerable people in our society are the ones who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. Anyway, I appreciate your time here, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. I've blown the time limit, so I don't know if you want to have questions now or